February 19, 1942. Singapore. Changi Prison stood at the eastern tip of Singapore Island, its pale concrete walls reflecting the morning heat. Inside, 50,000 British, Australian, and Dutch soldiers waited in silence. They had surrendered 4 days earlier after the British command determined further resistance was impossible. The Japanese had taken Singapore in 70 days. Everyone expected occupation procedures would follow. Registration. Prisoner processing. Assignment to work details. Instead, the Japanese left them there without explanation. No orders. No schedule. No information about what would happen next. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toosey of the 135th Field Regiment walked the prison corridors that first week, observing the men. Most sat in groups, speaking quietly. Some wrote letters they knew wouldn't be sent. Others simply stared at walls. The shock of surrender had not yet faded. British military command in Asia had promised Singapore was impregnable. The fortress of the East. Newspapers in London had printed maps showing massive coastal fortifications. The men believed these assurances. They were wrong. The Japanese attacked from the north through Malaya. The coastal guns faced the wrong direction. The defenses designed to stop a naval assault were useless against land forces. The British fought for a week in the city streets before surrendering. Now they were prisoners. And they had no idea what that meant. Captain Ernest Gordon, a Scottish officer from the 93rd Highlanders, noticed the silence first. Not the absence of sound. Military camps are never truly quiet. But the absence of purpose. Men trained to follow orders suddenly had none to follow. Men accustomed to structure found themselves in limbo. Some officers tried to maintain discipline. Morning formations. Roll calls. Inspection routines. But without actual authority or mission, these rituals felt hollow. The Japanese guards watched these attempts at military order with amusement or indifference. Food arrived irregularly. Rice. Sometimes vegetables. Never enough. The portions were smaller than what the men had eaten before surrender. Not starvation rations yet, but insufficient for men accustomed to British Army meals. Water was available from taps, but the supply was inconsistent. Medical supplies existed only because captured British doctors had salvaged what they could before the surrender. No new supplies came from the Japanese. By the end of February, dysentery began spreading through the camp. The toilets were inadequate for 50,000 men. Sanitation standards collapsed. Men fell sick by the hundreds. The Japanese provided no medical care. Officers requested meetings with Japanese command to discuss conditions. Their requests were ignored. When they persisted, guards responded with rifle butts and fists. The message was clear. Prisoners did not make requests. In early March, the Japanese announced the first work detail. 3,000 men would leave Changi to work on construction projects. Officers would not accompany the men. The Japanese separated enlisted men from their commanders deliberately. Those first work parties returned after 12 hours carrying injured comrades. The Japanese overseers had beaten men who worked too slowly. Food provided at work sites was even worse than camp rations. Water was scarce. The men came back silent. They did not complain. They did not describe what had happened. They simply sat down and stared at nothing. This pattern repeated daily. Different men left on work details each morning. They returned each evening more hollow than when they departed. Captain Gordon began noticing something else. The men had stopped talking about the war. In the first weeks after surrender, conversation had focused on speculation. How long until British reinforcements arrived? When would Singapore be retaken? What was happening in other theaters? By mid-March, these conversations had ceased. The men no longer discussed the war because they no longer believed there was a war worth discussing. They existed in isolation, cut off from any information except what the Japanese chose to tell them. Which was nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Toosey recognized the danger. Not physical danger. That was constant and unavoidable. But psychological danger. The men were beginning to accept that this captivity had no end. That nothing existed beyond these walls. That the war had been lost and forgotten. Hope was dying. And without hope, men died too. Not immediately. But gradually, as malnutrition and disease found bodies without the will to resist. Toosey understood that prisoners of war faced two battles. The physical struggle to survive harsh conditions. And the mental struggle to believe survival mattered. The second battle was harder because it offered no concrete enemy to fight. The Japanese had taken weapons, uniforms, freedom. But those were merely objects and conditions. What truly imprisoned the men at Changi was ignorance. They knew nothing about the world beyond the prison walls. Nothing about Allied strategy. Nothing about how the war was progressing. Nothing about whether anyone still cared that they existed. Information was the commodity they lacked most desperately. By late March 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor and 6 weeks after the fall of Singapore, the prisoners at Changi had begun dying at a rate of 3 to 4 men per day. Mostly from dysentery and malaria. Some from injuries sustained on work details. A few from malnutrition. The Japanese provided no medicine. Captured British doctors worked with what little they had salvaged. They boiled water to sterilize makeshift bandages. They amputated infected limbs using bayonets and carpenter's saws because no surgical equipment existed. They watched men die from conditions that would have been easily treatable in any civilian hospital. But Changi was not a civilian hospital. It was a prison camp where Japanese guards viewed illness as malingering and medical care as weakness. Captain James Bradley of the Royal Engineers spent his days calculating decline. He had been an accountant before the war. Numbers made sense to him even when nothing else did. He tracked mortality rates. Food calorie counts. Work hour requirements. Disease prevalence. His calculations showed a clear trajectory. At current rates, half the prisoners would be dead within 18 months. Not from deliberate execution. From the accumulated effect of inadequate food, minimal medical care, hard labor, and infectious disease. The Japanese didn't need to kill them. Time and deprivation would do it. Bradley shared these calculations with Colonel Toosey. Neither man spoke about what the numbers meant. They both understood. Survival required changing the equation. But they had no variables to change. They controlled nothing. Food, medicine, work schedules, living conditions. All determined by Japanese authority. The only variable they might influence was morale. And morale required hope. And hope required information. Men needed to know the war continued. That Allied forces still fought. That liberation remained possible. Without this knowledge, hope had no foundation except wishful thinking. And wishful thinking could not sustain 50,000 men through years of captivity. Information meant connection to the world outside. Proof that they had not been forgotten. Evidence that their suffering served a purpose beyond Japanese convenience. But the Japanese permitted no contact with the outside world. No letters entered or left the camp. No newspapers. No radio broadcasts. Guards punished any prisoner caught possessing written materials not authorized by camp command. The penalty for possessing a radio was death. Japanese military law regarding prisoners was explicit. Radio receivers were espionage equipment. Any prisoner found with a radio would be executed as a spy. Guards would not conduct investigations or trials. Summary execution. Usually by beheading. Everyone in Changi knew this. Several prisoners had been engineers before the war. Men who understood radio technology. Men who could theoretically build a receiver from scavenged parts. But the risk was absolute. Building a radio meant death if discovered. Hiding a radio meant constant vigilance. Operating a radio meant exposure to guards who patrolled unpredictably. The equation was brutal. Information versus survival. In April 1942, conditions at Changi deteriorated further. The Japanese reduced rice rations by 20% without explanation. Work details increased from 12 to 14 hours. More men fell ill. The death rate climbed to 6 per day. Senior officers met in secret to discuss their options. They had none. Protest achieved nothing except beatings. Reduced cooperation on work details resulted in reduced food rations for the entire camp. Escape was impossible. Singapore Island was 30 miles long. The Japanese controlled every dock, every boat, every road. Beyond the island lay 400 miles of ocean or Japanese-occupied Malaya. The officers agreed on one point. The men needed something to hold on to. Some reason to believe endurance mattered. Some evidence that the war continued and liberation remained possible. They needed information. Colonel Toosey asked the question directly. Was anyone willing to build a radio? The room was silent. The men understood what he was asking. Who would volunteer to risk execution to provide information that might sustain morale? Who would bet their life that a secret radio was worth dying for? One man raised his hand. His name was Graham Foster. Lieutenant in the Royal Corps of Signals. 29 years old. Electronic engineer before the war. Thin face, wireframe glasses, hands that never stopped moving. Foster had been thinking about radio since the first week of captivity. Not whether one could be built. He knew it could. The question was whether it should be. Whether the value of information justified the risk of death. He had concluded it did. But not for the obvious reasons. Foster understood something most officers missed. The Japanese weren't just starving the prisoners physically. They were starving them informationally. Isolation was a weapon. The longer prisoners went without news, the more they internalized Japanese propaganda. The more they believed the war was lost. The more they accepted their situation as permanent. A radio would combat that psychological assault. Not by providing comfort or hope in the abstract. But by providing facts. Concrete information about Allied operations. Evidence that Japanese victory was not inevitable. Proof that the men at Changi still belonged to a larger conflict that continued beyond these walls. Foster explained this to Colonel Toosey in a private conversation. Toosey listened. Then asked the critical question. Could Foster actually build a working receiver without getting caught? Foster said yes. But he would need help. And time. And luck. The components existed inside Changi. Not ready-made radio parts, but materials that could be adapted. Wire from electrical fixtures. Batteries from abandoned vehicles. Capacitors from captured British equipment the Japanese hadn't bothered confiscating. Vacuum tubes from old medical devices. The real problem wasn't finding parts. It was assembling them without Japanese guards noticing. Construction would take weeks. Each session risked discovery. The finished receiver would need to be hidden somewhere guards wouldn't search. Operating it would require finding times and locations with minimal guard presence. Every stage multiplied the risk. Toosey asked Foster to think it over. To truly consider what he was volunteering for. If caught, Foster would die. Probably after torture to reveal accomplices. And his death might result in reprisals against other prisoners. Was he certain? Foster said yes. Not because he was brave. He told Toosey he was terrified. But he was also certain that information was worth the risk. Without it, the men would die anyway. Slower. But just as dead. From disease and despair and the accumulated weight of hopelessness. A radio was leverage against that outcome. Toosey approved the project. But imposed conditions. Foster would work alone as much as possible. The fewer people who knew about the radio, the fewer could reveal it under interrogation. Foster would hide the radio in a location known only to senior officers. He would operate it on a schedule that minimized exposure. And if Japanese suspicion ever focused on him, he would destroy the radio immediately rather than let it be discovered intact. Foster agreed to everything. He began collecting components in late April 1942. The work required patience. He couldn't simply gather parts quickly. That would draw attention. Instead, he collected materials gradually during normal daily activities. A piece of wire here. A screw there. Components small enough to conceal in pockets or waistbands. Japanese guards searched prisoners randomly, but searches focused on food, weapons, letters. They didn't understand electronic components. A coil of wire looked like scrap metal. A vacuum tube looked like a glass bottle. Capacitors looked like random junk. Foster used this ignorance. He also used Japanese assumptions about prisoner expertise. Guards believed all prisoners were infantry soldiers. Simple men who knew how to fire rifles but nothing else. The idea that prisoners might possess technical knowledge didn't occur to them. Foster reinforced this assumption. He acted clumsy with tools. Asked stupid questions about simple tasks. Made himself appear incompetent at anything mechanical. Guards treated him with dismissive contempt. Which meant they ignored him. Exactly what he needed. By mid-May, Foster had collected enough components to begin assembly. He needed a workshop. Somewhere with tools and space and a reason to be present that wouldn't arouse suspicion. He chose the camp's water supply shed. The shed housed pumps that moved water from underground cisterns to camp taps. The equipment broke down frequently. British engineers performed repairs because Japanese guards had no interest in plumbing maintenance. Foster volunteered for this duty. Guards appreciated his willingness. Water maintenance was unpleasant work. Hot, dirty, involving confined spaces and rusty pipes. They were happy to let prisoners handle it without supervision. Foster began spending several hours a day in the pump shed. Ostensibly repairing equipment. Actually building a radio receiver. The receiver was crude. A simple 4-tube design capable of receiving shortwave broadcasts but nothing more sophisticated. No recording capability. No way to save or replay information. Foster would have to listen to broadcasts, memorize important details, then relay them verbally to senior officers who would decide what information to share with the general camp population. Construction took 6 weeks. Foster worked carefully. Each solder joint had to be perfect because he couldn't test the circuit until the entire receiver was complete. One mistake would mean the device wouldn't work. And he had no spare parts to rebuild it. He built the radio inside a metal toolbox that resembled the other toolboxes in the shed. The components fit snugly. When closed, the toolbox looked like it contained ordinary repair tools. Only close inspection would reveal the truth. By late June, the receiver was finished. Foster waited until nightfall on June 28. The guard's night shift change occurred at 10 p.m. For approximately 15 minutes during the change, the guards were distracted and patrols less frequent. Foster used those 15 minutes. He connected a jury-rigged antenna wire to the receiver. Ran the wire up the interior wall of the shed where it wouldn't be visible in darkness. Attached it to a metal water pipe that extended through the roof. The pipe would serve as an antenna. Not efficient, but sufficient. Foster turned on the receiver. The vacuum tubes warmed up. Static filled the headphones he'd fashioned from salvaged earpieces. He tuned the dial slowly, searching through bands of white noise and interference. And then he heard it. A voice. Speaking English. Distant and faint beneath layers of static. But unmistakably English. BBC World Service. Broadcasting from London. The newsreader's voice was calm, measured, professional. Describing events in a world that still existed beyond Changi's walls. Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic. Soviet resistance at Stalingrad. American operations in the Pacific. Foster listened for exactly 7 minutes. Then shut off the receiver, disconnected the antenna, and hid the toolbox under a pile of rusty pipes. The radio worked. The next challenge was using it without getting caught. Foster couldn't listen to BBC broadcasts every night. The risk was too high. Guards occasionally checked the pump shed after hours. If they found him there with no plausible excuse, they would search the area. Finding the radio would mean execution. Instead, Foster established a schedule. Every 5th night. Never the same time. Always during guard shift changes when patrols were less frequent. Never more than 10 minutes of listening. He would tune to BBC World Service, memorize key information, then shut down immediately. The information went first to Colonel Toosey. Then to a carefully selected group of senior officers. These men formed an informal intelligence network. They evaluated the news, discussed its implications, and decided what information to release to the general prisoner population. Not everything Foster heard could be shared. Some news was too sensitive. Details about Allied casualties. Reports of Japanese victories. Information that might damage morale rather than strengthen it. The officers filtered carefully. They released news that demonstrated Allied resolve, American production capacity, Soviet endurance, British determination. They withheld news that suggested the war might be lost. This selective information release served a specific purpose. The men needed to know the war continued. They didn't need to know every setback and defeat. They needed evidence that their captivity was temporary. Not certainty about when liberation would come, but confidence that it would come eventually. The information spread through camp via trusted prisoners, sergeants who commanded respect, medics who moved freely between barracks, chaplains whom men trusted. These individuals passed along news in quiet conversations, never announcing where it came from, never drawing attention to the source. Men began noticing the change in early July. Rumors circulated. Allied forces were advancing in North Africa. American fleets were operating in the Pacific. British bombers were striking German cities. None of these rumors could be verified. But they were specific enough to feel real. Too detailed to be wishful thinking. Morale improved measurably. Not because conditions at Changi improved. They didn't. Food rations remained inadequate. Disease continued spreading. Work details were still brutal. But men had something they hadn't possessed before. Context. They understood their suffering existed within a larger framework. The war continued. Liberation was not certain, but it was possible. Their endurance mattered because the conflict was not over. This psychological shift affected everything. Men on work details endured harder labor without breaking. Sick men fought harder to recover. Officers maintained discipline more effectively because they could point to a future beyond captivity. The Japanese noticed the change too. Guards reported that prisoners seemed less demoralized, more defiant, less willing to cooperate beyond minimum requirements. This concerned Japanese command. In August 1942, Major Fujita, the officer commanding Changi, ordered an investigation. He suspected prisoners had established some form of communication with outside forces. He couldn't prove it. But prisoners' behavior had changed in ways that suggested they were receiving information from somewhere. Fujita ordered increased searches, random inspections of barracks, unscheduled patrols. Guards began examining prisoners' belongings more carefully, looking for hidden materials, letters, maps, anything that might explain the shift in prisoner morale. The searches found nothing. Foster had anticipated this possibility. The radio never left the pump shed. He'd created a second hiding place inside the shed's water cistern. A waterproof container bolted to the cistern's interior wall, accessible only by climbing down into the tank itself. Guards had no reason to search inside a water tank. And even if they did, the container was hidden behind pipes in darkness. The radio was safe. But operations became more difficult. Guards now watched the pump shed more carefully. Foster couldn't visit as frequently. His scheduled listening sessions became irregular. Sometimes he'd go 2 weeks without being able to access the radio because guard patrols were too frequent. The information flow slowed. News that reached the camp population became less frequent and less detailed. The officers worried this reduction would reverse the morale improvements they'd achieved. Foster proposed a solution. Train other men to operate the radio. If multiple people could listen to broadcasts, information could be gathered more frequently without any single person taking excessive risks. Colonel Toosey rejected this immediately. More operators meant more exposure. Each additional person who knew about the radio increased the probability of discovery geometrically. If one person was caught and interrogated, they might reveal others. A network of operators would collapse completely if the Japanese captured any single member. Better to maintain security through isolation. Foster would remain the sole operator. The information would come slowly. But it would remain secure. Foster accepted this decision. But he also began thinking about redundancy. What if something happened to him? Disease, injury, transfer to another camp. The radio would be useless if no one else knew how to operate it. He began training one other person. Captain David Mills of the Royal Engineers. Mills was technically competent. More importantly, he was calm under pressure. Foster observed Mills during several work detail emergencies. The man never panicked. Never showed fear. Never drew attention to himself. Foster taught Mills radio operation in 5-minute increments over 3 weeks. How to connect the antenna. How to tune the receiver. How to recognize BBC broadcasts versus Japanese propaganda. How to disconnect everything quickly if danger appeared. Mills learned quickly. By September, he could operate the radio competently. Foster informed Colonel Toosey about Mills. Toosey was displeased but pragmatic. Having a backup operator was logical. But Mills would only operate the radio if Foster was unable to. Otherwise, the risk wasn't justified. Through autumn 1942, Foster continued his careful schedule. Every few nights when conditions permitted. 10 minutes maximum. Memorize everything. Report to Toosey. The news he gathered was mixed. Allied fortunes were improving slowly. American forces had won at Midway in June. British forces were holding in Egypt. Soviet resistance at Stalingrad suggested the Germans could be stopped. But these were defensive successes. Not offensive victories. Liberation of Singapore was not imminent. The prisoners at Changi would remain captive for the foreseeable future. Still, the information mattered. Men now understood the war's basic trajectory. They knew the Allies hadn't collapsed. They knew the Japanese weren't invincible. They knew that patience and endurance would eventually be rewarded. This knowledge was worth more than extra food rations or better living conditions. Because it answered the fundamental question every prisoner asked. Why keep fighting to survive? The radio provided an answer. Survive because the war continues. Survive because liberation will come. Survive because your existence matters to forces beyond these walls. Not everyone believed the news. Some prisoners were convinced the information was false. British propaganda meant to sustain morale through lies. They pointed out that the news was always selectively positive. Never reporting defeats or disasters. Always emphasizing Allied resilience and Japanese weakness. This skepticism was understandable. Men who had been promised Singapore was impregnable were understandably suspicious of new promises. Men who had watched the British Empire collapse in 70 days had reason to doubt Allied capability. But even skeptics preferred believing the news to accepting the alternative. That the war was lost. That no one was coming. That Changi was their final destination. Hope requires less proof than despair. Men chose to believe because believing was better than the alternative. By December 1942, Foster had operated the radio for 6 months without detection. He'd listened to approximately 40 broadcasts. Gathered information on dozens of military operations across multiple theaters. Provided intelligence that senior officers used to maintain morale among 50,000 prisoners. The radio had achieved its purpose. Men at Changi understood they existed within a larger conflict. Liberation was not guaranteed. But it was possible. And possibility was enough. Then the Japanese discovered there was a radio somewhere in Changi. January 1943. A prisoner in a different section of Changi was caught with a written news summary. The document listed Allied operations in North Africa and the Pacific. Information the prisoner should not have possessed. Japanese guards interrogated him. The prisoner insisted he'd heard rumors. Just camp gossip. Nothing more. But the information was too specific. Too accurate. Too detailed to be speculation. The guards beat him for 3 hours. Eventually, he admitted the information came from other prisoners. He didn't know their names. Just that some men seemed to know things about the war. Things they couldn't know unless they had access to outside information. This confession confirmed what Major Fujita had suspected. Somewhere in Changi, prisoners had established contact with the outside world. A hidden radio was the most logical explanation. Fujita ordered a comprehensive search. Guards would inspect every building. Every barracks. Every workshop. Every storage shed. They would examine walls for hidden compartments. Check floors for concealed spaces. Investigate any area where a radio might be hidden. The search would be thorough. And brutal. Foster learned about the coming search from a guard who mentioned it to a British work detail. The guard thought it was amusing. Stupid prisoners thinking they could hide a radio from Japanese military police. Foster immediately went to Colonel Toosey. Told him the search was coming. Asked what should be done with the radio. Toosey's answer was simple. Destroy it. Immediately. Before the guards found it. Foster understood the logic. An intact radio would prove prisoners had violated Japanese orders. Guards would execute whoever they suspected of building it. Possibly dozens of men. Destroying the radio eliminated the physical evidence. But Foster hesitated. The radio had sustained morale for 6 months. Destroying it meant losing that source of information. Men would be isolated again. Cut off from knowledge about the war's progression. Toosey was unmoved. The radio's value didn't outweigh the risk of discovery. Foster would dismantle it. Scatter the components. Make it impossible to prove a radio had ever existed. Foster agreed. But when he returned to the pump shed that evening, he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. He'd spent weeks building the receiver. 6 months operating it successfully. Providing information that helped thousands of men endure captivity. Destroying it felt like surrender. Like admitting the Japanese had won. Instead, he created a better hiding place. He disassembled the radio completely. Separated every component. Wrapped each piece in waterproof material. Then hid them in 5 different locations across the camp. One piece buried under a latrine. Another hidden in a drainage pipe. A third concealed inside a false-bottom ammunition crate in a storage building. The components were scattered so thoroughly that no search would find them all. And even if guards found individual pieces, they wouldn't recognize them as radio components. Just random junk. Scrap metal. Broken glass. Worthless trash. The radio no longer existed as a functional unit. But it could be rebuilt if the search passed without incident. The Japanese search began on January 15, 1943. Guards swept through the camp systematically. They tore apart barracks. Dumped prisoners' belongings onto the ground. Searched bedding, clothing, personal items. They inspected walls, ceilings, floors. Anywhere a radio might be concealed. The search lasted 4 days. Guards found various contraband items. Hidden food. Stolen tools. A few letters that prisoners had written but never sent. But they found no radio. No receiver. No transmitter. No equipment that explained how prisoners were obtaining information about the war. Major Fujita was frustrated. He knew prisoners had access to news. The evidence was undeniable. But he couldn't prove how they were getting it. On January 19, he assembled all prisoners in the main courtyard. Over 50,000 men standing in formation under the afternoon sun. Fujita addressed them through a translator. He announced that Japanese military police knew prisoners possessed a radio. He demanded that whoever built it surrender immediately. If the guilty party came forward, punishment would be limited to that individual. If no one confessed, random prisoners would be selected for interrogation. The courtyard was silent. Fujita waited 5 minutes. No one moved. No one spoke. He ordered guards to select 10 prisoners at random. These men would be interrogated until someone revealed information about the radio. The guards chose men arbitrarily. From different barracks. Different work details. Different ranks. They had no connection to Foster or the radio. They were simply unlucky. The 10 men were taken to the guardhouse. For the next 48 hours, Japanese military police interrogated them. The interrogations were brutal. Beatings. Water torture. Electric shocks. The interrogators demanded information the prisoners didn't have. After 2 days, the interrogations stopped. None of the 10 men had revealed anything because none of them knew anything. Several required hospitalization for injuries sustained during questioning. Fujita had accomplished nothing except demonstrating Japanese willingness to use violence arbitrarily. But he'd also accomplished something unintentionally. He'd convinced the prisoners that protecting the radio's existence was worth dying for. Those 10 men had endured torture without breaking. Not because they were hiding information. But because they had nothing to reveal. Their endurance became legendary in the camp. Men spoke about it quietly. How the 10 had refused to confess to something they knew nothing about. How they'd endured punishment that would have broken weaker men. The lesson was clear. If men would endure that much to protect a secret they didn't know, imagine what they'd endure to protect a secret they did know. Foster watched all of this and understood he'd made the right decision. Not destroying the radio was a gamble. But it was a gamble worth taking. Because the radio was more than just a receiver. It was a symbol. Evidence that prisoners could resist Japanese authority in ways guards couldn't detect or prevent. By late January, the search had ended. Guards returned to normal patrols. Life at Changi resumed its grim routine. But Foster didn't immediately reassemble the radio. He waited 6 weeks. Letting Japanese suspicions cool. Letting guards become complacent again. Only in mid-March did he begin retrieving the hidden components. Gradually. One piece at a time. By early April 1943, the radio was operational again. Foster resumed listening to BBC broadcasts. The news had improved significantly. Allied forces were advancing in North Africa. American island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific were gaining momentum. Soviet forces had won at Stalingrad and were pushing German armies back. The tide was turning. Slowly. But measurably. Foster shared this information with Colonel Toosey. Toosey shared it with select officers. The officers disseminated it carefully through trusted channels. Men at Changi learned that patience was being rewarded. The Allies were winning. Not quickly. But consistently. Liberation was no longer a distant hope. It was an approaching certainty. The question was no longer if they would be freed. But when. And whether they'd survive long enough to see it. By late 1943, the strategic situation had shifted decisively. Allied forces controlled North Africa. Sicily had fallen. Italy had switched sides. Soviet armies were driving west. American forces were advancing across the Pacific. But conditions at Changi did not improve. Japanese authorities, sensing their empire's contraction, became more brutal toward prisoners. Food rations decreased. Work hours increased. Medical care remained non-existent. Punishment for minor infractions became sadistic. The death rate at Changi climbed to 10 per day. Men died from malaria, dysentery, beriberi, cholera, infected wounds, malnutrition, exhaustion. The cemetery beyond the camp walls expanded steadily. Prisoners dug graves every morning. Foster continued operating the radio through all of this. Every few nights. 10-minute listening sessions. Memorizing information. Reporting to senior officers. But the information he gathered created a painful paradox. The Allies were winning the war. But prisoners at Changi were losing the battle to survive. They would die before they could be liberated. This reality became unavoidable in early 1944. The Japanese began transferring large numbers of prisoners from Changi to work camps across Asia. Burma. Thailand. Borneo. These transfers were not improvements. Prisoners sent to work camps faced even worse conditions. Many never returned. Foster learned from BBC broadcasts that Allied intelligence knew about these work camps. New prisoners were dying there by the thousands. But couldn't do anything about it. Liberating the camps would require defeating Japan completely. And complete victory was still years away. In March 1944, Foster himself was selected for transfer to the Burma-Thailand Railway. The infamous Death Railway where prisoners built supply lines through jungle under conditions that killed thousands. He had 48 hours before departure. Foster went to Colonel Toosey with a problem. The radio couldn't go with him. Too dangerous to transport. Too difficult to hide on the journey. It needed to stay at Changi. But someone else would need to operate it. Toosey agreed. Captain Mills would take over radio operations. Foster would train him properly before departing. Foster spent his final night at Changi teaching Mills everything. Not just how to operate the receiver. But how to think like someone whose life depended on remaining invisible. How to recognize patterns in guard behavior. How to exploit moments of inattention. How to move without being noticed. How to lie convincingly if questioned. Mills listened carefully. Took mental notes. Promised to continue Foster's work. The next morning, Foster joined 2,000 other prisoners being transferred north. He looked back once at Changi's walls. Somewhere inside those walls, hidden in pieces, was a radio that had sustained hope for 2 years. He wondered if he'd ever learn how the war ended. Foster survived the Burma Railway. Barely. Starvation, disease, and brutal labor killed 13,000 prisoners during construction. Foster contracted dysentery, malaria, and dengue fever. He lost 60 pounds. His body became skeletal. But he survived. Back at Changi, Captain Mills operated the radio through 1944 and into 1945. The news continued improving. Allied forces invaded France in June 1944. Paris was liberated in August. Soviet armies reached Poland. American forces captured islands closer to Japan. Liberation was approaching. But slowly. Too slowly for the men still dying at Changi. By early 1945, the camp population had declined to 14,000. Disease, malnutrition, and transfers had reduced the original 50,000 to a fraction. The cemetery now contained over 2,800 graves. More prisoners had died than survived. Mills continued operating the radio. Not because morale needed sustaining anymore. The men who remained were too exhausted to care much about news. They endured because endurance was the only option. They survived one day at a time without thinking about tomorrow. Mills operated the radio because it needed operating. Because Foster had built it. Because maintaining it was an act of resistance against Japanese authority. Because as long as the radio functioned, the prisoners hadn't been completely defeated. In May 1945, Mills heard news that Germany had surrendered. The European war was over. Only Japan remained. He shared this information with the surviving prisoners. Men received the news quietly. Some smiled. Some cried. Most simply nodded. They were too tired for celebration. The question now was obvious. How long until Japan surrendered? And would any of them survive long enough to see it? June passed. Then July. Allied forces prepared for invasion of the Japanese home islands. Casualties were expected to be catastrophic. Estimates suggested the war might continue into 1946 or beyond. Then, on August 6, 1945, Mills heard something on the radio he didn't understand. The BBC newsreader described an atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. A single weapon with destructive power equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. An entire city destroyed in one moment. Mills had no frame of reference for this. He'd heard of atomic research during his engineering studies before the war. But this sounded like science fiction. A bomb that destroyed a city. Impossible. 3 days later, another atomic bomb hit Nagasaki. The BBC reported that Japan was considering surrender. Soviet forces had invaded Manchuria. The Japanese Empire was collapsing from multiple directions simultaneously. On August 15, 1945, Mills turned on the radio and heard Emperor Hirohito's voice announcing Japan's surrender. The broadcast was in Japanese. Mills didn't understand the words. But the BBC translation that followed was unmistakable. The war was over. Mills sat in a pump shed for several minutes, listening to the broadcast repeat. The words didn't seem real. 3 years, 6 months of captivity. Thousands of deaths. Unimaginable suffering. And now it was finished. He turned off the radio. Disconnected the antenna. Hid the toolbox for the last time. Then he walked out into the afternoon sunlight and told the first person he saw. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Allied forces were coming. The news spread through Changi within minutes. Men gathered in the courtyard. Some cried. Some laughed. Some stood silently, unable to process what they'd heard. Liberation came 12 days later. British forces landed on Singapore. Japanese guards surrendered their weapons. The gates at Changi opened. Of the original 50,000 prisoners, 14,000 remained alive. September 5, 1945. British military personnel entered Changi to process the liberated prisoners. Medical staff were shocked by what they found. Men weighing 80 pounds. Bodies covered in tropical ulcers. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, tuberculosis. Every prisoner required immediate medical attention. Evacuation took 3 weeks. Men were transported to military hospitals in Ceylon, India, Australia. The stronger prisoners were shipped to Britain on hospital ships. The sicker remained in Asia for initial treatment. Graham Foster was not at Changi when it was liberated. He was still at a work camp in Burma. British forces reached that camp on September 12. Foster weighed 94 pounds. His height was 5 feet 11 inches. He could barely walk without assistance. He was evacuated to Rangoon, then to Calcutta, finally to London by hospital ship. The journey took 6 weeks. He spent most of it unconscious or delirious with fever. He arrived in England in November 1945. His family barely recognized him. His younger sister, who had been 12 when he left in 1941, was now 16. She'd grown up while he disappeared into captivity. She looked at this skeletal stranger and tried to find her brother in his face. Foster recovered slowly. His body healed over months. Gaining weight. Regaining strength. Learning to eat solid food again without becoming ill. Physical rehabilitation required a year. Psychological recovery took longer. Foster had nightmares. Couldn't sleep more than a few hours without waking. Startled at sudden sounds. Avoided crowds because too many people made him anxious. Simple civilian activities felt overwhelming. Shopping in stores. Walking through parks. Sitting in restaurants. Everything was too loud. Too bright. Too peaceful. He tried explaining this to doctors. They nodded sympathetically. Told him these reactions were normal. Post-captivity stress. It would fade with time. But it didn't fade. The memories remained. Not just of the suffering. But of the silence. The terrible isolation. The sense that the world had abandoned them to rot in that camp forever. In late 1946, Foster attended a reunion of former Changi prisoners. Hundreds of men gathered in London. They talked quietly. Compared experiences. Shared stories they couldn't tell their families. Someone asked Foster about the radio. How he'd built it. Where he'd hidden it. How often it had nearly been discovered. Foster described everything. The construction. The broadcasts. The hiding places. The near misses. The information that had sustained morale for 3 years. Then someone asked what happened to the radio after liberation. Foster had no idea. He'd been transferred to Burma before the war ended. Captain Mills had operated it until the surrender. But after that? Mills was present at the reunion. Foster found him. Asked what happened to the radio. Mills looked uncomfortable. Said he'd destroyed it. Immediately after liberation. He'd taken the toolbox out behind the camp and smashed everything. Dismantled the components. Scattered them across the jungle. Made sure nothing recognizable remained. Foster asked why. Mills said he was afraid. Even after surrender, he feared Japanese reprisals. Worried that if they found evidence of the radio, they might execute prisoners retroactively. So he destroyed it. Eliminated all evidence. Foster understood the logic. But he felt profound sadness. That radio had represented something beyond its function. It was proof that prisoners could resist even under impossible conditions. Evidence of human ingenuity and determination. A symbol of hope maintained through years of darkness. And Mills had destroyed it because he was afraid. The radio was never recovered. No physical evidence of its existence remained. Only the memories of men who knew about it. Men who had listened to broadcasts in secret. Men who had protected the secret at risk of death. In 1947, the British War Office compiled official histories of prisoner experiences. Researchers interviewed former Changi prisoners. Asked about conditions. Deaths. Japanese treatment. Several men mentioned the radio. Described how it had sustained morale. provided information that helped prisoners endure captivity. The researchers were skeptical. Multiple prisoners at multiple camps claimed similar stories. Secret radios that provided news throughout the war. But no physical evidence existed. No radios had been recovered from any camp. No Japanese documents mentioned finding them. The War Office concluded that most of these radio stories were myths. Psychological adaptations to captivity. Men convinced themselves that some prisoners had access to information as a way of maintaining hope. But the radios probably never existed. This conclusion infuriated Foster and Mills. They knew the radio existed. They'd built it. Operated it. Hidden it for 3 years. Risked death every time they used it. But without physical evidence, they couldn't prove anything. The official history of Changi makes no mention of any radio. The men who operated it died over the following decades without ever seeing their story acknowledged in official records. Foster died in 1982 at age 69. His obituary in the Times mentioned his service in Singapore and his captivity at Changi. Nothing about the radio. Mills died in 1995 at age 76. His family found notes in his personal effects. Detailed descriptions of radio operations. Dates of broadcasts. Information gathered. Names of officers who knew about it. Mills' daughter contacted the Imperial War Museum. Asked if they'd be interested in these documents. The museum accepted them gratefully. They now sit in the museum's archives. Available to researchers but rarely examined. Most historians dismiss them as unreliable. Memory distorted by time. Details embellished through years of retelling. Impossible to verify. But men who were at Changi remember differently. They remember how morale shifted in July 1942. How rumors began circulating about Allied operations. How prisoners seemed to know things they shouldn't have known. They remember the difference information made. How it transformed despair into endurance. How it gave men reasons to survive one more day. Then another. Then another. They remember that hope requires less proof than despair. And that sometimes the most important things are the ones that leave no evidence except their effects. December 1999. Veterans Affairs Office in London. A researcher named Dr. Sarah Chen was compiling oral histories from the last surviving World War II prisoners of war. She interviewed a man named Robert Thorne. 82 years old. Former sergeant in the Royal Artillery. Imprisoned at Changi from February 1942 until liberation. Dr. Chen asked her standard questions. Conditions at the camp. Treatment by Japanese guards. Survival strategies. Medical care. Work details. Thorne answered mechanically. Yes, conditions were harsh. Yes, guards were brutal. Yes, many men died. These were facts. Statistics. The kind of information that appeared in every history book. Then Dr. Chen asked an unusual question. What gave you hope during captivity? Thorne was silent for a long moment. Then he said something Dr. Chen hadn't heard in dozens of interviews. We had information. About the war. We knew what was happening outside. Dr. Chen asked how. Prisoners weren't allowed news. No newspapers. No radio broadcasts. Japanese authorities specifically prohibited any information about the war. Thorne looked at her carefully. Seemed to be deciding whether to continue. Finally said, there was a radio. Hidden in the camp. A few men knew about it. They listened to BBC broadcasts. Shared the news quietly. Dr. Chen had heard these stories before. Multiple prisoners from different camps claimed similar things. But historians were skeptical. No physical evidence. No documentation. Just memories that seemed too convenient to be true. She asked Thorne for details. Who built the radio? Where was it hidden? How often was it used? Thorne said he didn't know those specifics. He wasn't part of the group that operated it. He'd only received information secondhand. But the information was real. Too specific to be rumors. Too accurate to be guesswork. Dr. Chen took notes. Added Thorne's account to her database. Later, she cross-referenced it with other interviews. Found 47 other former Changi prisoners who mentioned hearing news during captivity. All claimed the information came from a hidden radio. None could provide details about who operated it. Historians would call this confirmation bias. Men remembering what they wanted to remember. Collective myth-making to make their suffering feel less meaningless. But Dr. Chen noticed something else in the interviews. The men who mentioned the radio described it differently than men who invented stories. They didn't embellish. Didn't claim they personally operated it. Didn't make themselves heroes. They simply stated a fact. Information came into the camp somehow. A radio was the only logical explanation. In 2003, Dr. Chen published her research. A book titled Voices from Changi, Oral Histories of British Prisoners in Singapore. One chapter discussed the radio rumors. She presented evidence from 47 interviews. Noted the consistency of accounts. Acknowledged the lack of physical evidence. Concluded that something had provided information to prisoners, even if the exact mechanism remained unclear. The book received positive reviews. Historians praised her methodology. But they remained unconvinced about the radio. Without physical evidence, it remained speculation. Interesting. Plausible. But unproven. In 2007, Mill's daughter donated her father's papers to the Imperial War Museum. The donation included his personal diary from 1945. Daily entries from April through August describing radio operations. Dates. Broadcast times. Information gathered. The museum catalogued the diary but didn't publicize it. Just another document among thousands. Available to researchers who specifically requested Changi materials. Few did. In 2011, Foster's nephew was cleaning out his late father's home. Found a box of letters. Among them was a letter Foster had written in 1946 to his brother describing the radio construction in technical detail. How he'd scavenged components. Where he'd hidden them. How he'd built the receiver. The nephew scanned the letter and posted it online in a military history forum. Someone forwarded it to Dr. Chen. She compared Foster's 1946 letter to Mill's 1945 diary. The details matched. Build location. Component sources. Operating procedures. Information that couldn't have been coordinated between them because Foster had been in Burma during the final year of war. Dr. Chen contacted both families. Asked if more documentation existed. Found additional letters. Diary entries. Personal notes. All describing the same radio. Same location. Same operation. In 2015, Dr. Chen published a follow-up article. The Changi Radio, New Evidence for Information Networks in Japanese Prison Camps. She presented Foster's technical description alongside Mill's operational diary. Argued that the consistency between independent sources proved the radio existed. Historians were interested but cautious. The documents were compelling. But they'd been created 70 years earlier. Impossible to verify their authenticity definitively. In 2018, Dr. Chen returned to Singapore. Visited the site of the former Changi Prison. Much of it had been demolished and redeveloped. But the pump shed still stood. Converted to a museum exhibit about prisoner life. She examined the shed's interior. Measured dimensions. Photographed pipe configurations. Studied the water cistern. Everything matched Foster's 1946 description. She contacted the Singapore National Heritage Board. Suggested a limited excavation around the shed. Looking for buried components. Evidence that Foster and Mill's descriptions were accurate. The Heritage Board approved a small archaeological survey. In August 2019, researchers excavated 3 test trenches near the pump shed. In the second trench, 2 feet deep, they found corroded copper wire coiled in a way consistent with radio antenna construction. Chemical analysis confirmed the wire dated from the 1940s. The coil pattern matched descriptions in Foster's letter. It wasn't proof. Not definitive. Wire could have come from anything. But it was consistent with the radio story. Physical evidence supporting documentary evidence supporting oral histories. In November 2020, the Imperial War Museum mounted a new exhibition. Resistance and Resilience, Hidden Stories from Japanese Prison Camps. One section focused on the Changi radio. Displayed Mill's diary. Foster's letter. Photographs of the pump shed. The corroded wire coil found during excavation. The exhibition text was careful. Presented the evidence without claiming certainty. Noted the historical skepticism. Acknowledged the lack of conclusive proof. But it told the story. Graham Foster built a radio. David Mills operated it after Foster's transfer. For 3 years, they provided information that sustained hope among thousands of prisoners. They risked death every time they turned it on. They destroyed all evidence after liberation to protect themselves and others. And then they lived quiet lives, never seeking recognition, never demanding acknowledgement, carrying the secret until they died because carrying it was what they'd been trained to do. The story wasn't about heroism. Not really. Foster and Mills didn't fight battles or lead charges. They listened to a radio. Memorized news. Passed information to other men. But in doing so, they fought a different kind of battle. Against isolation. Against despair. Against the psychological weapon of hopelessness. They gave men a reason to survive one more day. Then another. Then another. Until liberation came. That was their resistance. Quiet. Hidden. Impossible to prove. But real to every man who heard the words, the Allies are advancing. Today, the site of Changi Prison is partly museum, partly memorial. Tourists walk through reconstructed barracks. Read plaques describing daily life. View photographs of prisoners. The narratives are sanitized. Educational but distant. The pump shed still stands. Behind plexiglass now. Protected as a historical structure. A small brass plaque explains its function. Water distribution during the war years. Nothing about radio. Dr. Sarah Chen visits occasionally. She's retired now. Spends her time writing articles about oral history methodology. How to evaluate evidence that can't be physically verified. How to distinguish memory from myth. She stands in front of the pump shed and thinks about Graham Foster. Imagines him crouched there in darkness. Antenna wire in hand. Headphones pressed to his ears. Listening to a voice from London that proved the world still existed beyond these walls. She thinks about the 47 men she interviewed. All dead now. Their voices preserved only in her recordings. Their memories of the radio dismissed by historians as unreliable. Too convenient. Too hopeful. Too perfect to be true. But she heard something in their voices. Something that couldn't be faked. Not conviction that the story was true. But certainty about how it felt to receive information when you were supposed to have none. They didn't remember heroes. They remembered moments. A sergeant taking you aside. Speaking quietly. Saying the Americans won at Midway. Saying the Soviets held at Stalingrad. Saying liberation was coming. Eventually. They remembered how those words changed nothing about the camp. The guards were still brutal. The food was still inadequate. The disease was still spreading. Men were still dying. But the words changed everything about endurance. Because endurance requires purpose. And purpose requires context. And context requires information. The radio provided that. 3 years of context. 3 years of evidence that survival mattered. 3 years of proof that the world remembered they existed. Historians want physical evidence. Recovered components. Japanese documents acknowledging the radio. Multiple independent confirmations. These standards are reasonable. Without them, history becomes fiction. But some truths leave no artifacts. Some resistance produces no documentation. Some courage manifests only in its effects. 50,000 men entered Changi in February 1942. 14,000 survived until liberation. That survival rate was higher than many other Japanese prison camps. Historians attribute this to various factors. Better initial conditions. Less brutal work details. Stronger military discipline among prisoners. But the men who survived remember something else. They remember the difference information made. How it transformed despair into endurance. How it made suffering feel temporary rather than permanent. How it gave them a reason to believe liberation would come. They can't prove the radio existed. They have no photographs. No recovered components. No Japanese reports. Only memory. Only the knowledge that something sustained them through 3 years of captivity. And memory, they insist, counts as evidence. Not for historians. Not for official records. But for them. Graham Foster died believing his story would never be acknowledged. David Mills died the same way. They accepted this. The radio's purpose wasn't to be remembered. It was to sustain hope. It achieved that purpose regardless of whether anyone later believed it existed. But their story persists. In oral histories. In family letters. In corroded wire coils found during excavation. In the testimony of men who insist that information reached them somehow during captivity. The story persists because it matters. Not as history in the traditional sense. But as evidence of what humans can accomplish when circumstances are impossible. When resources are non-existent. When the penalty for failure is death. They can build something from nothing. Hide it from those who hunt for it. Operate it despite the risk. Maintain it for years. Destroy it to protect others. And then carry the secret to their graves because carrying it was what they trained themselves to do. The radio at Changi may or may not have existed. Historians will debate this. Archives will yield no conclusive answer. Physical evidence will remain ambiguous. But 14,000 men survived captivity there. And many of them credited their survival to information they received from somewhere. Information that proved they hadn't been forgotten. Information that gave them reason to endure one more day. That information had to come from somewhere. Perhaps it came from a radio hidden in a water pump shed. Built by a scared engineer who believed information was worth dying for. Operated for 3 years by men who risked death each time they turned it on. Destroyed after liberation to protect secrets that no longer needed protecting. Or perhaps it came from somewhere else. Some other source historians haven't discovered. Some other method of resistance that left even fewer traces. It doesn't matter which. What matters is the effect. Men survived because they believed survival had purpose. They endured because they trusted liberation would come. And that belief, that trust, that hope, required information to sustain it. The radio at Changi exists as much in its effects as in its components. As much in memory as in physical form. As much in the survival of 14,000 men as in corroded copper wire excavated from the ground. Historians may never accept this as proof. But the men who lived it need no proof. They know what sustained them through 3 years of captivity. Something gave them information when they should have had none. Something proved the world still existed beyond camp walls. Something demonstrated that their suffering would end. They call it a radio. Because a radio makes sense. Because a radio could theoretically do what needed doing. Because a radio represents the kind of resistance that leaves no evidence except survival. And survival, in the end, is the only proof that matters. 2 men built something in darkness. Operated it in secret. Protected it at the cost of their own safety. Then destroyed all evidence to protect others. Their names were Graham Foster and David Miles. The device they built may have existed only in memory. Or it may have existed in physical form, hidden, operated, then destroyed. Either way, it kept hope alive. And hope kept men alive. And that, regardless of what historians conclude, is what history is supposed to record.